My mother called me a disappointment and excluded me from family gatherings. She regretted it when my aunt revealed I graduated from Harvard Law. Hey, Reddit. So my mother decided I was the family failure when I dropped out of nursing school at 19, and she spent the next 9 years telling everyone I'd probably ended up homeless or in jail. Plot twist. I graduated from Harvard Law and became a federal prosecutor. She found out at Thanksgiving dinner when my aunt laid out my credentials on the table like a hand of cards. What happened next turned into a legal nightmare that required restraining orders and courtroom testimony. Buckle up. I'm Sarah, 28 years old, and I need you to understand something about my mother before we get into the chaos. She didn't just disapprove of my choices, she actively erased me from the family narrative. When I dropped out of nursing school, she used the word failure to my face. Not disappointed, not concerned. Failure. She told me I'd wasted her genetics, her time, and her money raising someone who couldn't even finish a basic degree. Here's the thing about toxic parents. They don't just cut you off quietly, they make a production of it. My mother called aunts, uncles, cousins, and explained that I was too embarrassing to have at family gatherings anymore. Said seeing me would just remind everyone of wasted potential. She literally uninvited me from Christmas that year via text message, "Don't come. Your presence would ruin the mood for people who actually achieved something." I was living in my car at the time, working double shifts at a warehouse distribution center, making $11.50 an hour, trying to figure out my next move. The warehouse job was brutal. 10-hour shifts lifting boxes in a facility where summer temperatures hit 95 degrees inside and winter meant frozen loading docks at 5 a.m. My hands were constantly cut up from cardboard edges and packing tape. I'd park my beat-up 2003 Honda Civic behind a 24-hour gym, pay $30 monthly for a membership just to shower, and sleep in the back seat with everything I owned stuffed into 2 duffel bags. My mother didn't know any of this, didn't care to ask, never once checked if I was okay or safe or alive. My Aunt Rachel found me crying in a grocery store parking lot that Christmas Eve. I'd gone in to buy a $6 rotisserie chicken, my planned Christmas dinner, and completely broke down in the checkout line when the cashier wished me happy holidays. Rachel was behind me in line, saw me falling apart, and without hesitation took me home. She fed me actual food, let me sleep in her guest room with clean sheets and a real mattress, and never told my mother where I was. Rachel became the family I needed when mine disappeared. She helped me apply to community college, looking over my application essays at her kitchen table until 2 a.m. Co-signed my apartment lease when I had zero credit history, and my mother's voice in my head saying I'd never amount to anything. Showed up when I had absolutely no one else. I started taking paralegal courses during the day at community college. Criminal Justice 101, Legal Research Methods, Court Procedures and Documentation. Worked at a small law firm at night, filing papers and organizing case files for $14 an hour. The firm was 3 attorneys in a converted house downtown, handling everything from traffic tickets to small business contracts. Nothing glamorous, but I was finally around people who used their brains for something other than tearing others down. The senior partner, this older guy named William, started noticing I understood the cases better than some of the first-year associates they'd bring in. I'd catch legal issues in documents, point out precedents they'd missed, ask questions that made him pause and reconsider his approach. 6 months in, he pulled me aside after I'd spotted a major problem in a contract that would have cost his client $40,000. "You're wasting your potential filing papers," he said. "Have you ever thought about law school?" The idea seemed impossible. Me? Law school? I was the family failure who dropped out of nursing school and lived in her car. But William offered to write me a recommendation letter if I applied, and something shifted in my brain. Maybe I wasn't the story my mother told everyone. I took the LSAT 4 times before getting a score high enough for decent schools. First attempt, 151. Second, 157. Third, 163. Fourth attempt, after 6 months of studying every morning before my warehouse shift and every evening after the law firm, 171. High enough to be competitive at top-tier schools. My aunt drove me to every single test. 3-hour drives to the testing center because our town didn't have one. She'd wait in the parking lot with coffee and encouraging texts, then drive me home while I either celebrated or cried depending on how it went. I applied to 14 law schools with fee waivers. Got rejections from 8, waitlisted at 3, accepted at 2. And then the email that changed everything. Harvard Law School, with a need-based financial aid package that would cover most of tuition. I sat in Rachel's kitchen staring at my laptop screen, reading the acceptance email over and over, convinced it was spam, or a mistake. Rachel looked over my shoulder, screamed, and started crying harder than I've ever seen anyone cry. We celebrated with $8 takeout Chinese food and stayed up until 4 a.m. looking at photos of Harvard's campus online. Meanwhile, my mother was telling everyone I was probably homeless or in jail. I know this because relatives would occasionally mention it to Rachel. Such a shame about Sarah. And your sister must be heartbroken about how that turned out. My mother had created an entire narrative about my failure, used me as a cautionary tale at family dinners about what happens when children don't listen to their parents. My brother Danny managed a cell phone store. Nothing wrong with that. Honest work, decent money. He seemed happy enough. But my mother treated him like he'd cured disease, posted constantly on social media about successful mothers raising successful children, always featuring Danny and conspicuously ignoring that she had 2 kids. She'd comment on family photos about being blessed with 1 good child, implying she only had 1 child total. Relatives stopped asking about me entirely. If someone mentioned my name at family gatherings, she'd say, "We don't discuss that like I died or committed murder." I became the family ghost, the cautionary tale, the daughter who didn't exist except as a warning. 3 years of law school without a single word to my mother. I studied contracts and constitutional law while she told people I'd probably ended up on the streets. Took finals while she posted about family values. Graduated magna cum laude with a 3.8 GPA and received a job offer from a federal judge for a prestigious clerkship that paid $68,000 a year. More money than I'd ever imagined making. Aunt Rachel sat front row at graduation in a hat she'd bought specifically for the occasion, crying so hard she couldn't see her phone screen to take photos. She'd flown to Cambridge on a budget airline, stayed in a hostel to save money, and refused to miss seeing me walk across that stage. After the ceremony, we went to this little Italian restaurant near campus, and she toasted me with house wine. To the girl who proved everyone wrong. That same week, my mother was posting on social media about successful mothers raising successful children, meaning my brother, who'd just gotten promoted to district manager. She'd write captions about being blessed with a child who makes me proud, and relatives would comment congratulations without realizing the insult embedded in the singular child. I passed the bar exam on my first attempt. Started working for the Justice Department's Criminal Division in Washington, D.C., prosecuting federal fraud cases. My starting salary was $72,000, with government benefits and a pension plan. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood, furnished it slowly with stuff from IKEA and estate sales, and built a life where nobody expected me to fail. I argued my first federal case at 28, standing in a courtroom defending the government's position on securities fraud. Won the motion. Earned respect from colleagues who had no idea about the family drama or the car I'd lived in or the warehouse job that destroyed my hands. My aunt kept a scrapbook of every achievement, newspaper clippings when my cases made the news, copies of my law review article, photos from court appearances she'd drive down to attend. She documented the life my mother refused to acknowledge existed. Last Thursday was Thanksgiving at my grandmother's house in our hometown. I hadn't been to a family gathering in 9 years. The last one had been that Christmas I got uninvited from, and I'd made peace with never attending another. But Aunt Rachel called me 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, with this tone in her voice I couldn't quite read. "I want to handle something special," she said. "Do you trust me?" I trusted her completely. She'd earned that 1,000 times over. So I said yes without knowing the plan. The whole family gathered. 37 people crammed into my grandmother's house. Aunts, uncles, cousins I barely remembered, second cousins, family friends who might as well be blood. My mother was holding court in the living room when I arrived, mid-story about my brother's promotion to district manager of 3 stores. She had this way of telling stories that made everything sound more impressive than it was, like Danny had founded Apple instead of managing retail locations. "I raised him with values and direction," she was saying to an audience of relatives who nodded along. "That's what makes the difference between children who succeed and—" Aunt Rachel stood up before my mother could finish the thought. "I have an announcement," she said loudly enough that conversations died mid-sentence. My mother looked annoyed at being interrupted, that flash of irritation she got when someone disrupted her performances. Rachel pulled out a folder from her bag, thick, official-looking, the kind lawyers carry into court. She started pulling out documents one by one, laying them on the dining table like she was dealing cards. My law degree from Harvard, the official one with the Latin and the seals and the signatures. My bar certification from the D.C. Bar Association. Letters of recommendation from 2 federal judges, one from my clerkship supervisor and one from a judge I'd worked with on an appeal. An article about my latest case from the Washington Post, a fraud prosecution that resulted in a 15-year sentence and $8 million in restitution. She laid them out methodically while everyone went completely silent. You could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen. Someone's phone buzzed and they silenced it immediately. Since some people seem unaware, Rachel said, looking directly at my mother with this expression I'd never seen before. Pure steel. Your daughter graduated from Harvard Law School 3 years ago. She's a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice. She argues cases in federal court and has a 94% conviction rate on fraud charges. My mother's face went through about 17 different expressions in 10 seconds. Shock, disbelief, confusion, anger, more confusion. She grabbed the diploma off the table, checking the embossed seal and the signatures like it might be fake. Her hands were shaking. This can't... How? She stammered, unable to form complete sentences. My Uncle Jeff asked the obvious question. How long have you been a lawyer? Rachel answered for me, her voice carrying across the silent room. 4 years. 4 years of your niece being a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C. And her mother had no idea because she banned Sarah from family events and told everyone not to mention her name. My grandmother, sitting in her usual chair by the window, asked the question that cut deepest. How could you not know your own daughter was at Harvard? My mother tried to say I'd hidden it from her, that I'd deliberately kept her in the dark, that this was somehow my fault for not reaching out. The excuses fell flat in a room full of people staring at the evidence on the table. Rachel wasn't done. She pulled out her phone and started showing text messages from years ago. Screenshots of conversations where my mother had said I was worthless and would probably end up in prison. Messages where she'd specifically told relatives not to help me because I needed to learn consequences the hard way. Email chains where family members had asked about me and my mother responded that some children are born wrong and can't be fixed. The room erupted into chaos. Relatives demanding explanations. My grandmother crying about missed years, about a granddaughter she'd been told to not contact. My brother Danny admitting he'd known where I was, but had been told not to say anything, which earned him furious looks from about 6 different people. My mother tried to hug me then, switching tactics like she'd been coached. We can start fresh, she said, reaching for me with tears streaming down her face. This is wonderful news. We can put the past behind us and... I stepped back, keeping distance between us. You were right about one thing, I said, my voice steady, despite my heart trying to break out of my chest. I was a disappointment. I disappointed you by succeeding without your permission. I left before anyone could argue or guilt-trip me into staying. Rachel drove me to Thanksgiving that day, and she drove me home. We didn't talk much during the hour-long drive back to my apartment. Just sat in comfortable silence while I processed what had happened. But my mother found my address somehow, learned later that Danny gave it to her, and showed up at my doorstep the next evening. I opened the door to find her standing there in the hallway outside my apartment, dressed up like she was heading to church, holding her purse with both hands. We need to discuss your monthly fund, she said. No hello, no, how are you? Just immediate demands. I stood in my doorway, gripping the frame to keep steady, trying to process what I'd just heard. I'm not discussing anything tonight, I managed to say, voice surprisingly calm despite the shock hitting me like cold water. She started to push past me into the apartment, like she had every right to enter. I stepped into the doorway, blocking her, repeating that she needed to leave. My hands were shaking, but I kept my voice level. This conversation is over. You need to go. My mother's face shifted through confusion, then anger, then this calculated sweetness she used when manipulation became necessary. We're both adults, she said with forced pleasantness. We can talk about this reasonably. I just need a few minutes to explain my situation. We're done for tonight. If you want to talk, it needs to be another time with proper notice. Leave now. She switched back to anger, the mask slipping. You're being dramatic and childish. After everything at Thanksgiving, you owe me the chance to speak. The entitlement in her voice, like I owed her anything after 9 years. You need to leave. Now. My voice got firmer, more final. She stepped back but said she'd wait in her car until I was ready to be reasonable. I closed the door and locked it immediately, every deadbolt and chain. Through the peephole, I watched her stand in the hallway for 5 solid minutes before finally turning toward the elevator. The second she was gone, I called Rachel with shaking hands, barely able to hold the phone steady. She answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting. She knows where I live, I said. And then I was breaking down completely, all the composure from earlier just evaporating. Stay put. Check all your locks. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I did a full check of every window latch and door lock, then sat on my couch trying to slow my breathing. My phone buzzed. A text from Danny. My stomach dropped before I even read it. Mom really needs help. Just hear her out. So he'd given her my address. The betrayal hit different, because I thought he at least stayed neutral in all this. Another text came through. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Family helps family. I didn't respond. Just screenshot both messages and added them to a folder I was starting to keep. Rachel arrived exactly 20 minutes later with an overnight bag. I unlocked the door after checking the peephole 3 times. She came inside and immediately started making tea while I paced my apartment, words spilling out about the doorstep demand and Danny's betrayal, and how my mother had tracked me down. Rachel listened while the kettle heated, then calmly said, "We need a plan for the morning, but tonight is just about feeling safe and getting sleep." She sat up on my couch with blankets and pillows. I tried to sleep but lay awake most of the night, replaying Thanksgiving dinner, imagining my mother showing up at my office building, or causing a scene at the courthouse, or calling my boss. Every small sound in the building made me jump. Footsteps in the hallway, doors closing, the elevator dinging. Around 4 a.m., I finally drifted off from pure exhaustion. Woke up a few hours later to 3 missed calls from my mother and another text from Danny. She just wants what's fair. You owe her for raising you. My hands shook as I showed Rachel. She read the messages with a tight expression, then suggested I send one clear text to my mother setting a boundary, then block her number and switch to email-only contact. I spent 30 minutes drafting and redrafting the message. I will not be providing any money. If you need to contact me, use email only. Do not come to my home or workplace again. My finger hovered over the send button for a full minute before I pressed it. Then I blocked my mother's number while Rachel watched. Over the next hour, my mother tried calling from 3 other numbers. I blocked each one as they came in. I got ready for work on autopilot, putting on my suit, grabbing my briefcase, trying to act like this was a normal Monday. Rachel offered to drive me to the office, but I told her I needed to try doing normal things, that I couldn't let this derail my whole life. My mother left 4 voicemails on my work phone before I even arrived at the Justice Department building, each one cycling between saying she was my mother and deserved respect, to listing everything she'd given up for me, to warning I'd regret treating family this way. I saved them all as records, my stomach turning as I listened to her voice shift from sweet to threatening. My colleague Sydney noticed me looking shaken at my desk and asked if everything was okay. I gave a vague answer about family stress, not ready to explain the whole situation. Sydney brought me coffee without asking again, which helped more than she probably knew. My supervisor, Gwendolyn, called me into her office mid-morning, and my heart dropped, thinking somehow my mother had already contacted the department. Instead, Gwendolyn gently said she'd noticed I seemed distracted, and asked if there was anything affecting my work I needed to discuss. I made a split-second decision to be honest. Told her I was dealing with a family member who'd become pushy, that I was handling it, but wanted her aware in case there were any attempted contacts to the office. Gwendolyn took it seriously immediately, asked if I felt safe, whether I needed help with building security or documentation. I explained the situation briefly, kept it professional and factual, and she said she'd loop in the right people to make sure I was protected at work. She picked up her phone and called HR while I was still sitting there, putting it on speaker, explained to someone named Rita that this was a potential security concern involving family harassment of a federal employee. Rita asked if I was comfortable coming down to her office right now to file a formal report. We walked down 2 floors together. Rita had me fill out an incident report form documenting every contact my mother had made since showing up at my apartment. Asked specific questions about whether I felt physically safe, whether my mother had made threats, whether I needed workplace accommodations. She printed out a copy for me and one for building security, then walked me down to the security office herself. The head of security listened carefully as Rita explained, and I provided my mother's full name and description. He pulled up the visitor log system and added a note that she wasn't authorized for building access under any circumstances, flagging it as a security alert. He gave me his direct cell number and told me to call immediately if she showed up anywhere near the building. Walking back to my desk, I felt protected in a way I hadn't since this started, like there were actual systems in place instead of just me trying to handle it alone. That evening, I was heating up leftovers when my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin Jennifer, someone I hadn't talked to in probably 5 years. She sent me a screenshot of a Facebook post my mother had made an hour ago. Something vague about how some children forget where they came from and turn their backs on the people who sacrificed everything for them. The post already had 23 comments, mostly from relatives I barely remembered, and my mother's friends, all saying supportive things about what a good mother she was, and how ungrateful kids were these days. My hands shook reading through the comments, seeing my mother play victim to an audience who had no idea what actually happened. I screenshot the post and all the comments before she could delete them, saving everything to a folder Rachel had told me to start keeping. The folder already had the voicemails, the texts from Danny, and photos of my mother at my apartment door that the building concierge had helped me get from security footage. Each piece of evidence felt like protection, but also like proof that this was really happening, that my mother was escalating instead of backing off. My grandmother called around 9 p.m. that night, her voice tired and sad in a way that made my chest hurt. She asked if we could all just sit down and talk things through like family, maybe have dinner at her house where everyone could say their piece calmly. I loved my grandmother and knew she meant well, but I told her gently that talking hadn't worked for 9 years when I was the one being shut out. Explained that I needed space right now to figure things out and protect myself, that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but couldn't let my mother harass me just because we were related. My grandmother was quiet for a long moment, then said she understood, though her voice sounded hurt. Asked me to at least keep her updated so she didn't worry. I promised I would, because I didn't want her caught in the middle. The next day, Rachel showed up at my apartment after work with her laptop and a determined expression. She sat up at my kitchen table and started showing me things I'd never seen before. Screenshots of text messages between her and my mother from years ago, back when I first got cut off. Email chains where my mother told relatives I was worthless and would probably end up in prison. Messages where she specifically instructed people not to help me, because I needed to learn consequences the hard way. Rachel had been saving all of it for years, creating a digital record of every cruel thing my mother said about me when she thought I'd never see it. Reading the messages hit harder than expected because seeing the words in writing made them more real somehow. My mother had called me a waste of space in an email to my uncle. Told Rachel I was going to end up homeless and it would serve me right. Said in a group text that some children are just born wrong and can't be fixed. Rachel watched me read through everything with a sad but steady expression. When I finally looked up, she said this was why she'd been documenting, because she knew one day I might need proof that I wasn't overreacting or being dramatic. The cruelty documented in black and white validated every boundary I was trying to set now. My phone rang from a number I didn't recognize the next afternoon while I was reviewing case files. I answered thinking it might be work-related, and Danny's voice came through immediately. He launched into this explanation about how my mother was in a financial crisis, behind on her mortgage by 3 months, and she thought I'd want to help now that I was successful and making good money. The way he framed it made anger flash through me, like my mother's money problems were somehow my responsibility to solve. I cut him off. I'm not discussing money with you or Mom. This conversation is over. Before I hung up, I asked him directly why he'd given her my address when he knew I kept it private. The question made him go quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. Mom threatened to kick me out of her house if I didn't help her contact you. The words shifted something in my understanding. Danny was still living under her roof at 32, still financially dependent, still subject to her control. He explained he'd been trying to save money to move out, but it was hard on his salary, and my mother used that as leverage. I felt a complicated mix of anger at him for giving up my address and sympathy for realizing he was trapped in his own way. I can't fix your situation, I told him. You need to make your own choices about what you're willing to tolerate. But I won't be your enemy if you can start respecting my boundaries. He apologized, and I believed he meant it, even though I wasn't ready to fully trust him yet. That evening, Rachel came over, and we spent 3 hours at my kitchen table researching legal options. Looked up information about cease and desist letters, restraining orders, harassment documentation requirements. Rachel took notes while I bookmarked relevant legal sites. We talked through pros and cons of each option. I was hesitant to involve lawyers because it felt like such a huge escalation, but Rachel pointed out my mother had already escalated by showing up at my home and demanding money. We decided I should consult with a private attorney rather than using anyone connected to my work. Rachel mentioned she knew a family law attorney named Phyllis, who specifically handled estrangement cases. She offered to make an introduction, and I agreed. The next morning, getting ready for work, an email notification popped up from my mother's address. Subject line, invoice for services rendered. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. I sat on my bed and clicked the email. Found a detailed breakdown that made my hands start shaking. She'd listed estimated costs for raising me from birth to 18, line items for food, housing, education, clothing, medical care, even something labeled emotional labor and guidance. The total came to $247,850. At the bottom, she'd written, a monthly payment plan of $2,000 would be fair compensation for my investment in raising you. As a successful federal prosecutor, Earning $72,000 annually? You can easily afford this. First payment due by end of month. She included payment instructions, her bank account routing number and account number, like this was an actual business transaction. I read through the invoice 3 times, trying to process that my mother had actually made a spreadsheet billing me for my childhood, treating my existence like a loan that needed repayment with interest. I forwarded the email to Rachel and Phyllis without adding any comment because I was too stunned to formulate a response. Rachel called within minutes, her voice tight with anger, asking if I was okay. Phyllis replied within an hour with a professional message. This type of manipulation is more common than you'd think in estrangement cases, and it's actually helpful documentation of harassment for any legal proceedings. Parents attempting to bill adult children for childhood expenses have zero legal standing, and this shows a clear pattern of financial coercion. She offered to meet today or tomorrow to discuss options for establishing legal boundaries. I responded saying, tomorrow afternoon worked because I needed a day to process. I spent the rest of the morning at work trying to focus on my cases, but my mind kept drifting back to that invoice. To my mother calculating the cost of every meal she'd ever fed me, every piece of clothing she'd bought, every roof over my head. Like those weren't basic parental obligations, but business expenses requiring return on investment. That weekend, Rachel suggested we visit my grandmother together. I agreed because I didn't want my grandmother caught in the middle or fed lies about what was happening. We drove to her house Saturday afternoon and found her looking older than at Thanksgiving, more tired and worn down by the family drama. She hugged me tight before we even sat down, holding on longer than usual. Over tea at her kitchen table, she started telling me stories about my mother's childhood I'd never heard before. How my mother was always concerned with appearances and what neighbors thought. How she'd get upset if my grandmother wore the wrong clothes to school events, or if their house wasn't perfect when guests came over. My grandmother described how my mother had cut off her own sister, my grandmother's daughter, years ago over some perceived slight at a family wedding, and they didn't speak for 5 years. Told me about how my mother kept score of every kindness and expected repayment with interest, bringing up favors years later and demanding equivalent returns. The stories gave me context I'd never had before, painting a picture of generational patterns that helped me understand my mother's behavior without excusing it. My grandmother held my hand across the table and said she was sorry she hadn't seen these patterns clearly enough to protect me from them. None of this is your fault, I told her, squeezing her hand. She kept talking, describing my mother as a teenager refusing to wear hand-me-downs, even when money was tight, how she'd rather skip meals than be seen in clothes that weren't new. The pattern clicked into place. That invoice wasn't some desperate one-time thing, but completely consistent with how my mother viewed every relationship as a transaction. Headlights swept across the kitchen window. My grandmother glanced out, then back to me with a worried expression. Danny's car pulled into the driveway, and I felt my whole body tense. He walked in looking like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under bloodshot eyes, shoulders slumped. He nodded at Rachel and my grandmother, then looked at me and asked if we could talk privately. I didn't want to, but Rachel gave me a small nod, so I followed him out the back door into my grandmother's small yard. The motion sensor light clicked on, and we stood there in the November cold, our breath making clouds in the air. He started talking before I could say anything, words tumbling out about how he'd been my mother's go-between with relatives for years. Delivering her version of events, actively discouraging people from reaching out to me. He admitted he'd tell aunts and uncles I was doing fine when they asked, that I preferred being left alone, all while knowing my mother was calling me a failure. His voice cracked when he said he was tired of it, that he didn't know how to extract himself when he was living in her house and financially dependent on her letting him stay there. I can't fix your situation, I told him, crossing my arms against the cold. I won't be your enemy, but you need to make your own choices about what you're willing to tolerate. He nodded, looking at the ground, then admitted my mother's debts were worse than he'd told me, that she'd been borrowing money from relatives for years and was actually facing foreclosure on the house. I felt a small flicker of something that might be sympathy, but I reminded myself that financial crisis didn't justify 9 years of cruelty or showing up at my door demanding monthly payments. Monday morning, I sat in Phyllis's office, a small space with legal books lining the walls and case files stacked on every surface. I laid out the entire situation, being cut off at 19, 9 years of silence, the Thanksgiving revelation, my mother showing up at my door, the invoice email, all of it. Phyllis took notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and specific incidents. When I finished, she explained my options, starting with a formal cease and desist letter establishing clear boundaries and consequences, escalating to filing for a restraining order if harassment continued. We decided to start with the letter, strongly worded but giving my mother one clear chance to back off before involving court. Phyllis said she'd have a draft ready by the end of the week. I left her office feeling like I'd taken a concrete step instead of just reacting to whatever my mother did next. That afternoon, I met with my apartment building's property manager, showed her photos of my mother on my phone, explained this person wasn't welcome in the building under any circumstances, and police should be called if she appeared. The manager took it seriously, made notes in her system, offered to change my lock codes immediately. I accepted and she walked me through the new codes twice. The next day at work, my supervisor assigned me to a high-profile case involving federal fraud charges, the kind that could make or break a prosecutor's reputation. I threw myself into preparation, grateful for the distraction and the reminder of what I'd built. Thursday morning, my mother emailed again, this time with a softer tone saying she just wanted to reconnect and start fresh, making no mention of the invoice like that whole thing never happened. I recognized the manipulation tactic immediately. Pressure, then retreat, then pressure again, wearing people down until they gave in. I didn't respond, following Phyllis's advice to maintain no contact while we prepared the legal letter. Friday afternoon, Rachel called me at work, which she never did. I answered worried something had happened to my grandmother. Instead, she told me my mother had shown up at her house an hour ago, pounding on the door and demanding to know what Rachel had been telling me. Rachel refused to engage and told my mother to leave, but my mother stood on the porch for 20 minutes, yelling about betrayal before finally driving away. I felt guilty that my boundary setting was affecting Rachel, pulling her into conflict she didn't deserve. She cut me off firmly. This isn't your fault. I can handle your mother. You need to stop taking responsibility for other people's bad behavior. Monday morning, Phyllis emailed me the completed cease and desist letter. I read through it twice. Legal language clear and firm, establishing that I was requesting no contact except written communication regarding my grandmother's welfare, and that violations would result in legal action, including potential restraining orders. The letter listed specific incidents with dates: the doorstep visit, the invoice email, the harassment at Rachel's house. I sent Phyllis my approval, and she responded she'd send it via certified mail today. For 3 days after that, I felt like I was holding my breath. Every phone buzz made me jump. Every unfamiliar email made my heart race. I checked the tracking number obsessively. Rachel called Wednesday evening and reminded me the waiting was part of the process, that I was doing everything right, that I couldn't control how my mother responded, but could control how I protected myself. Thursday afternoon, the tracking showed my mother signed for the certified letter at 2:47 p.m. By 6:15 p.m., my inbox pinged with an email from her. Subject line: legal threats from my own daughter. The email ran long and messy, jumping between how hurt she felt and claims I was using my legal training to bully my own mother. She wrote about sacrificing everything raising me, and this was how I repaid her. How I was breaking her heart and destroying the family. Then accused me of turning Rachel against her, of poisoning my grandmother's mind. The worst part hit when I scrolled down. She'd copied Danny, 3 aunts, 2 uncles, and my grandmother on the email, clearly trying to get everyone on her side. I screenshot everything immediately and forwarded to Phyllis with a note asking if this counted as violating the letter. Within 20 minutes, my phone started buzzing with email notifications as people began replying. My uncle Robert replied first, telling my mother that legal boundaries were reasonable and she needed to respect them. My uncle James added that maybe everyone should take a step back. My grandmother asked everyone to please handle this privately instead of through group emails. 2 aunts didn't respond at all. Danny replied saying we should all talk this through as a family, his usual middle ground approach. Saturday morning, Danny emailed me separately from his personal account instead of replying to the group thread. He wrote that my mother had been crying for 2 days straight and was threatening to show up at my office if I didn't respond soon. The email made me feel guilty for about 30 seconds before I remembered I'd spent 9 years being the one abandoned with nobody worrying about me. I forwarded his email to Phyllis. A week later, Danny was served with papers. The fraud victim had already filed charges for wire fraud and misrepresentation. Wait, that's from a different story. Let me correct. A week later, I got a call from the building security guard. My mother had shown up at the Justice Department building trying to get upstairs to my office, claiming it was an emergency. Security followed protocol, asked her to wait while they contacted me. I confirmed she wasn't authorized. They escorted her out and called police when she refused to leave the lobby. The police report added to my documentation folder. Phyllis said we now had strong grounds to file for a restraining order. 2 weeks after the first cease and desist letter, I made the decision sitting at my desk typing out an email to Phyllis, authorizing her to move forward with restraining order paperwork. She started preparing the petition using all our documented incidents, the emails, the police report, witness statements from Rachel and my grandmother. Danny moved into Rachel's guest room after finally giving notice at my mother's house. He started attending therapy twice a week, working through years of being caught in the middle. He called me one evening and told me his therapist was helping him see how much he'd enabled our mother's behavior by going along with it. We started meeting for coffee occasionally, 30-minute conversations at neutral locations where we talked about work and apartment hunting. Small steps toward being siblings again without the weight of our mother's expectations. The restraining order hearing got scheduled 3 weeks out. I prepared my testimony with Phyllis, practicing staying calm and factual when describing the harassment pattern. Gwendolyn continued being supportive at work, giving me flexibility for legal appointments while making sure my caseload stayed manageable. 2 days before the hearing, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Danny's voice sounding stressed, telling me our mother was in the hospital asking for me. The automatic guilt hit like a wave. Then I paused and asked questions. What happened? Which hospital? What are the doctors saying? He hesitated before admitting she'd gone to the ER for chest pain, but tests came back clear. Just anxiety and stress. She was being discharged in a few hours. The manipulation became obvious, the urgency that didn't match the actual medical situation. I told him I hoped she got appropriate care for her anxiety, but I wouldn't be visiting. The hearing day arrived. I dressed carefully in a navy suit, pulling my hair back, looking every bit the federal prosecutor I was. Phyllis met me outside the courtroom, and we reviewed strategy one more time. The room was smaller than I expected, just a judge's bench and a few rows of seats. My mother arrived representing herself and sat across the aisle, not looking at me. When my turn came, I walked to the witness stand and took the oath, voice steady even though my hands were shaking. I testified clearly about the pattern of harassment, the doorstep visit, the invoice, the police report, the violations of the cease and desist. Phyllis guided me through each incident with questions that let me lay out the timeline chronologically. My mother tried to interrupt twice, but the judge told her to wait her turn. When Phyllis finished, my mother got to ask questions. She tried to paint me as vindictive, asking why I was doing this when she was my mother. I kept my answers short and factual. I'm here because you violated boundaries repeatedly, despite being asked to stop. Phyllis presented our documentation: emails, photos, police reports. Rachel's written statement described the scene on her lawn. My grandmother's statement confirmed my mother tried to use her as a go-between. The judge read through everything carefully. My mother got her chance to speak, talked about how I was her daughter and she just wanted to reconnect, how she didn't mean any harm, how I was using my legal training to bully her. The judge listened without expression, then asked specific questions about the cease and desist letter, about showing up at Rachel's house after being told to stay away. My mother stumbled through her answers, contradicting herself twice. The judge took a 5-minute recess to review materials. Those 5 minutes felt like an hour. When she came back, the judge started speaking in a calm, measured tone. She granted a 1-year restraining order with specific provisions. My mother must stay at least 500 feet from my home, workplace, and any location she knows I frequent. Cannot contact me directly through any means. Can only contact through her attorney, and only regarding genuine emergencies involving my grandmother. The judge explained violations would result in immediate arrest and potential jail time, that my mother needed to take this order very seriously. Relief washed through me as the judge spoke, finally having legal protection with real consequences instead of just requests my mother could ignore. My mother stood, her chair scraping loudly, and walked out without looking back. Phyllis squeezed my shoulder. You did great. The order is solid and enforceable. Rachel was waiting in the hallway. We drove to a quiet restaurant and ordered sandwiches neither of us really tasted. Rachel teared up when I thanked her for everything. The years of support, the documentation, showing up today. We toasted with our water glasses to chosen family and boundaries that actually stick. The relief over the next few days was almost physical, like I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. Work stabilized immediately because the constant fear of my mother appearing was gone. I threw myself into cases with energy I hadn't had in weeks. 2 months later, Danny called to invite me to see his new apartment. He'd moved out of Rachel's guest room after saving enough for first and last month's rent. Small studio in an older building. Nothing fancy but clean and his. We ordered pizza and ate sitting on his floor since he only had one chair. He thanked me for not completely shutting him out despite his role in the family mess. I told him I was glad he was building his own life separate from our mother's control. My grandmother and I fell into a routine of quiet dinners at her house every other week, just the two of us without drama. We talked about her book club and my cases, and it was peaceful in a way family gatherings never were. 6 months after the Thanksgiving revelation, I was sitting in a meeting with my supervisor, and she was talking about my performance on the high-profile case we'd won. Mentioned potential for advancement, maybe a lead position on the next major case. I realized sitting there that protecting my boundaries had freed up mental energy that made me better at my job. My reputation at work was solid, built on successful cases and thorough preparation. Danny texted saying he'd enrolled in 2 classes for next semester. My grandmother sent me a card about how proud she was. The restraining order sat in my file cabinet with 0 violations. 3 weeks later, Danny texted that our mother had sold the house and moved into a small apartment across town, gotten a job at a retail store, seemed focused on paying off debts. I read the message twice, waiting for some big feeling, but all I got was quiet acknowledgement that consequences were real. Rachel called on Friday and invited me to dinner the following week. Danny and my grandmother were coming too. I stopped at the wine shop on my way over and picked out something nicer than usual. We ate Rachel's lasagna and talked about my grandmother's book club and Danny's apartment furniture and Rachel's garden plans. After dinner, we played cards at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Danny made jokes about my grandmother's card counting skills, and nobody kept score. My grandmother said this was what family dinners should feel like, and we all agreed without needing to say more. I drove home that night feeling settled in a way I didn't know was possible with family. YouTube just dropped this new hype feature. If you're hooked on this story, smash that hype button. It tells YouTube this video deserves to blow up, and it keeps even crazier stories coming your way.